Thank you everyone for joining us today. We're going to get started in about a few seconds. I think we'll let a couple of minutes. People are still streaming in. Actually, we've got almost we're about way above 100 participants right now, which is great. I know we have far more signed up. But anyways, I'm just going to get started because we do have 1 hour and I want to be respectful to everyone's time. I'm Eugene. I'm the CEO of Venngage. We're an accessible document platform, and I'll be moderating today's roundtable on document accessibility. So we're here today to talk about why document accessibility matters. We have an amazing panel of experts, and I'm going to ask each member of the panel to very quickly introduce themselves. Most of you probably know who they are, but just in case, and tell us a little bit about their work. But before I go into that, just a little bit of housekeeping. We will be doing a Q&A at the end of the session. There will be 15 minutes for Q&A. So if you have a question anytime throughout this session, just feel free to use the Q&A box, add your questions in there, and then we will hopefully try to answer all of them at the end of the session. Okay, so let's dive right in. We'll start with some introductions. I've already done mine. We'll start with Michael. Go ahead.
Great. So I'm Michael Parker. I'm the director of Access Ingenuity, and Access Ingenuity has been active in the document accessibility space for about 20 years now. So nice to meet everybody here.
Thank you, Michael. Let's move on to Chad.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Chad Chilius. I use the title Accessibility Wizard as a fun little title to use, but I work at CHACS Training and Consulting, and we obviously specialize in document accessibility, particularly focusing on training, consulting, and really just kind of helping people through the process of creating accessible PDF files. Welcome, everyone.
Awesome, Chad. And finally, we've got Dax on our panel as well.
Hey, everybody. I know there's some couple polls that we're going to start too, right? Some questions to ask people. But my name is Dax Castro. I'm an Adobe certified accessibility trainer. Chad and I do a podcast called CHACS Chat. And if you follow me on social media at all, you know that I'm super passionate about accessibility. So I'm really excited to be with this group of amazing panelists to talk about some really great topics today, the accessibility flywheel.
Awesome. Yeah. And speaking of the poll, just to give us a sense of who our audience is, we've got a couple of questions. If you don't mind answering them real quick, it should pop up on your screen. Go ahead and answer it, and then we'll get started real quick.
Also, to let everybody know that if you stick around to the end, if you get to the Q&A part, we have 3 really super handouts that we're going to give everyone, one of which is getting buy-in, unlocking C-suite motivation. The other one is a PDF accessibility checklist. And then basically an overview flyer for the actual session, kind of some of the major points that you're hopefully going to take away from today. So stick around to the Q&A part, and right before Q&A, we'll give you the Dropbox link to go download that information.
Thanks for reminding us for that, Dax. All right, so let's get started. As I mentioned, today's roundtable is about accessibility, I think, obviously. But I think we want to start with understanding the challenges. What are the most common roadblocks organizations face when trying to achieve accessibility, especially around PDFs and document accessibility? And how can they overcome these roadblocks or challenges? Why don't you start, Dex?
Well, I think that the biggest roadblock that initially people have is awareness, right? Oh, well, we don't have any people with disabilities in our organization, or, oh, well, that's just for the couple of blind people that might view our document every once in a while. Do we really have to make everything accessible? So it's that initial lift of letting people know that, hey, it's likely if you have 8 males in your organization, it's likely one of them is colorblind. The statistic, is up to 12% of males are colorblind. And so it's not just about people who are blind, but people with cognitive disabilities and colorblind and low vision. Most of us, I know I'm supposed to be wearing glasses, but I don't even have them sitting on my desk. So I think it's just getting that awareness is really the key. Yes, Chad, exactly. The key initial first step is that awareness part.
Very cool. Yeah, awareness, I agree. Awareness is the first and foremost biggest roadblock. How about you, Chad? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think for a lot of organizations, one of the big roadblocks they run into is getting the buy-in from the other people, often higher ups, within their organization. One of the reasons for that, a lot of people take the or have the feeling that accessibility is expensive, right? And although there certainly are costs associated with accessibility, right? But really, it kind of comes down to, getting people to understand the value of accessibility, understanding who accessibility impacts, right? I mean, sometimes, Dax and I will get into a little bit of I don't want to say a rut, but, we often speak to people who use screen readers. But as Dax pointed out, there are people who benefit from accessibility that go far beyond people who do not have sight, right? As Dax pointed out, low vision, colorblind, mobility impairments, cognitive impairments. I mean, it's a very, very broad range of people who are affected by, who can benefit from us making our documents accessible. So I feel like getting the buy-in from the higher ups is one of the key things. And I would, look for those people, who show interest, who are interested, who see the value in it, and kind of leverage them to help you through the process.
Very cool. So building on that, Michael, what are some misconceptions around accessibility that people often have, and that kind of leads them to not address those issues?
Michael, you're on mute.
There we go. I think one of the main misconceptions is really how hard it is. And I think that what you really want to do, and what this session is really about, is actually starting with your source documents. So starting early, building it into your organization, it can make the overall cost of accessibility much more affordable and much more achievable. So I think that's a major issue there.
Okay. And I want to follow up with Dex, your point on awareness, right? I think the big problem on awareness. What does an organization do when they don't have, or when it's only a small group of people who are aware or are interested in accessibility, and everyone else, either because they don't have the buy-in from the leadership or for whatever reason are not sort of aware of accessibility at all, and it's very hard to implement things. So how do you overcome the awareness issue?
Well, it kind of goes hand in hand with buy-in, right? But I think that a lot of people think technology solves the problem. AI is going to solve it, or auto tag is going to solve it, or, well, they can just open the document and it'll just do it for them. Or doesn't Acrobat make documents accessible? Or, right. And so I think they rely too heavily on the fact that technology is going to somehow be the magic pill. And it really is about showing I feel the most impact that I've gotten from groups is when I show that user experience. Hey, did you know, here's how this table sounds. Here's how this picture sounds. Here's how this chart or graph sounds. And almost always, they have never heard a screen reader voice that kind of content before. And almost invariably, their reaction is, wow, I never knew. And a lot of time, that's the spark that helps push that envelope to the next level.
Oh, and I agree. And I have been in one of your classes where you did exactly that, and you played the screen reader. And yeah, and the reaction is, wow, for some, they've never heard a screen reader before. And and they are now able to empathize with someone who's actually and what the experience looks like. That's a great point. Chad, would you like to add to that? What do you think? What else can we do to get buy-in from an organization when we're trying to launch an accessibility program?
Well, like I said, within an organizational environment, what I would do is I would look for the people who are showing interest in accessibility, right? And usually you can pick those people out, right? When you're in a meeting or you're having a discussion with people, typically there are some people in that meeting that are asking really interesting questions, and they want to know more. They want to know more about that. And I would gravitate to those people, because those are the people who are going to help you, get that buy-in and potentially, move things further up the chain to help you in the process. And I mean, similar to what Dax just said about, the screen reader example, I've shown a similar example showing somebody what a bar graph looks to somebody who's colorblind, right? They created this bar graph, and they're using yellow and orange and red, and you show that to somebody in colorblind mode, and they're like, oh my gosh, I can't tell anything apart, right? So it's a really poignant moment, when you can, really show somebody in real time what the implications are of not doing this correctly.
I just wanted to add to that. I think that most document authors want to make sure that whatever they're creating is accessible to everybody. And so getting that buy-in by helping them understand what actual users with disabilities experience is really key. And we actually have 3 of our staff members are blind themselves, and it's really helpful to have them give feedback on the work that we create and assist with trainings and really get that buy-in.
I will add, going way back to my very first document accessibility foray, Michael's team brought a gentleman named Z into my organization when I worked at California High Speed Rail. And I had my very first screen reader class with him, and he is a gentleman who is blind and taught the entire class. And I was so enthralled with the idea of using the screen reader and not having the screen on and being able to really, I think the exercise was, you have a class on Thursday at 4 p.m. at this college. You're starting from this place, figure out what bus you need to take and at what time. And it was just really powerful to work through that. So I definitely think, at CHACS, we have people with lived experiences as well. I think it really is important to have that perspective, because as the saying goes, nothing about us without us. And having someone with a lived experience, the perspective is, we can only approximate. I have my own disabilities, but they don't include vision. And so that perspective is just unique.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about tools. I know, Dax, you made the comment that it's, there's an overemphasis on tools. But so let's broaden it. Instead of just tools, let's talk about solutions. And this would include tools and processes. Is there anything in your sort of toolbox right now? We'll start with Michael, actually.
I was just going to say, let's give Michael.
Yeah. What sort of tools and technology have you found most effective for addressing accessibility, especially around document accessibility? And I kind of want you to build on that comment you made on how it actually isn't difficult. So how do the tools help with that?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is really looking at what tools the organization is using. And so from your digital, your authoring tools, if you're using tools like InDesign, if you're using, Venngage, if you're using Canva or Microsoft Word or things like that, understanding those tools and then the limitations those tools have. So I think that's really critical. Once you understand what those limitations are, then you know what your document remediation process probably needs to be like, and you can build your document remediation process around that. Unfortunately, some authoring tools are much, much more difficult to make accessible than others. And so if you choose some tools such as Canva, for example, your remediation process is going to be much more difficult. And so I think that starting with tools that give you a head start in that process goes a long ways. And then from there, there's the other thing that's really critical is actually just building that experience within your team so that you can quickly look at things like color contrast or document layout or other choices that you are making so that you can actually create good accessible content and creating templates. So accessible templates that you can use across your organization.
100% agree. It's tool. I always advocate the same tool choice and then have templates, so you don't have to start from scratch. Chad, we've talked about tools, and I know both you and Dex are big Adobe, folks. But let's talk a little bit about processes and workflows. How can organizations sort of make their processes and workflows kind of less overwhelming, right? Because I think a lot of we do hear very often that, if we, making a document accessible adds a lot of overhead to the workflow or to the process. What's your experience with this, and how do you make these processes a lot more streamlined?
I would say, honestly, I feel like the answer to that question, one of the really big factors is education, right? Probably the biggest factor that leads to success in making documents accessible is simply using the tools the way they were designed to be used, right? So whether that's Microsoft Word, whether it's Microsoft PowerPoint, whether it's Adobe InDesign, the key to most of it is using those products and using the features that are built into those products, right? Dax and I always say, right, like in Microsoft Word, there's like 5 key things you need to do to create a relatively barrier-free PDF file and to make the document itself accessible as well, right? There's just kind of like 5 key things that you need to do. And if you do that and you follow those steps, implement that into your process, it's going to lead to success. And I think it's important for us to talk about baby steps too, because I think when you look at accessibility from the big picture, it can seem overwhelming, right? You're like, oh my gosh, this is so much more work. How am I going to get all this work done? But if you take baby steps, right? Like, so like in Microsoft Word, learn how to use styles, learn how to add alt text to your documents, learn these fundamental things, and it's going to pay huge dividends, right? So it doesn't have to be this overwhelming, thing, Now it gets a little more complicated when you get to Adobe InDesign. But again, if you know how to use InDesign, it's really not that big of a deal, right? I would say the same thing about PowerPoint, right?
Cool. Now
Dax wanted to add something to what I said.
Yeah.
Moving on to Dax. Yeah.
I think the biggest factor is when you start. I think the tools are great. No, absolutely agree with everything that's been said. But if you wait till the very end to make accessibility, you make a document and then make it accessible, you have made it 3 times harder for yourself if you didn't have good document hygiene like Chad talked about along the way, using the program the way it was intended. We all learn differently. We've learned our own ways of doing things. And sometimes that fights accessibility at the end when we're like, oh, well, I do a table this way. Well, maybe now you can't make that table accessible. So I think it really boils down to starting from the beginning and considering accessibility at the start, getting a good color palette. We know that, Vengage's tools allow you to set up those color palettes correctly and make sure that they're accessible. InDesign does the same exact thing. Word's a little harder to kind of set those, but if you have a company if your company has a department that is in charge of your brand style guidelines, making sure those are in line with good accessibility practices for color contrast and tables and things like that helps you just exponentially make documents easier to be more accessible.
Yeah, 100% agree again on
Eugene, I just wanted to
addressing
add,
this at the start. Go ahead, Michael. Yeah.
I just wanted to add one thing, and I think we're going to get into this in a little bit more later on today, but measuring is also really key. And so basically developing some feedback mechanisms so people get feedback on the files they're creating. And after you do a training or after you kind of have a process in place to create documents, that there's tools to actually measure the accessibility of those documents.
And do you have any recommendation for, what's the best practice around the measure? I think a lot of times people forget that. They just do the training and then it's like, and I think, the reality is most people take a training and then they may remember 10% of what they've learned. And then 3 months later, it just goes back to old habits. And next thing you know, that training is not effective, right? What is your recommendation how to measure
Well,
and
I think it
keep
really depends on the organization. I think that having some kind of closed loop where you actually have to make sure that your files are accessible before they're posted or submitted, and having some kind of either checklist, and I think you're going to share a checklist at the end, having some screen reader testing, going through the processes to really make sure that your content is accessible. That's really a key part of this whole process. And then, measuring that internally within the organization.
Okay. I want to touch a little bit. I want to ask some questions around training, since I know, I think all of you provide training. And we talked a little bit of here and there. Is there, what's the bare bones type training you would recommend? Or, if somebody were to start out or some company were to start fresh in accessibility, what's the minimum viable training they should have? We can start with Chad.
Start with me. So what I've run into, so we live in an age where everybody wants to go to YouTube and figure out how to do something. And listen, a lot of times that works great. I mean, I've fixed my snowblower and my weed whacker. I've fixed all my washing machine. I fixed on YouTube. It's a really powerful platform. What I've run into within the realm of document accessibility is that unfortunately there's a lot of misinformation out there. And so if you are new to accessibility, eager to learn, and you go onto YouTube and go down the wrong rabbit hole, you could end up just wasting so much time, and literally going the wrong direction. And that's really unfortunate. I really want to tell you, there's great, and there is some good content on YouTube. I mean, Dax and I have stuff up there on YouTube, and there is some other good content on there, but I would just be careful, right? And really watch yourself. I'm gonna like toot my own horn here, and I apologize, but one option, if you've ever heard of LinkedIn Learning, LinkedIn Learning is a great resource where you could go, and I have a couple of courses on LinkedIn Learning specifically about document accessibility. Beyond that, like if you're willing to, invest a little bit more money and energy into the process, in my opinion, nothing beats live training, right? I mean, again, in this day and age, we could do a lot on Zoom or using whatever meeting platform of choice you wish. We can also do live training, right? I mean, everybody learns differently, right? Some people don't learn well watching a video. I've run into a lot of people who've told me that. They're like, yeah, I really don't learn well that way. So I would say, look at resources that offer training on exactly what you're trying to do, right? If your organization is primarily creating, you're trying to make Word documents accessible, or you're trying to make accessible PDFs from Word, right? Or you're trying to create EPUBs, right? Find an organization that's going to provide that type of training for you so they can send you down the right path and avoid you wasting valuable time.
Cool. Dax, you want to add to that?
No, I think I'm good. I think Chad covered that pretty well. There was a question. So for everyone in the chat, we love the questions, and I am feverishly trying to answer the questions and give some stuff. But just remember, if you ask your question in the Q&A portion, then if I haven't answered it already by the end of the session, we will definitely answer it if you put it in Q&A. Because remember, there's hundreds of comments, really great conversations going on right now in the chat. One about hard returns. Hard returns are something that definitely can be solved, but not manually. There's third-party programs. Common Look and Access Word are both programs that will remove extra hard returns. Actually, Made to Tag is one for InDesign that will do it as well. So when you get down to the how can I do this faster, better, stronger, it's almost always with plugins. There are some trainings and things you can do to get it better with InDesign, with the source file or with Acrobat itself, but that's where those third-party programs, although I would love to talk to you to talk about Eugene's new thing with forms, right? So forms have always been the bane of everybody's existence. And if you're primarily using Word to make forms, you know that you've got to make the base layer in Word and then go into Acrobat and do all this extra stuff. Eugene had showed us some beta versions, but now I believe it's out for public release, right? The accessible forms.
It is, yes.
Yeah. So you can go into Venngage, create your single page forms or multi-page forms, and they're accessible on export, which is really great to have a tool that's not InDesign, because we know InDesign can do forms well and it's super great, but it's also has a higher learning curve and isn't always available for everyone.
And there aren't many options out there for forms, right? Like if you're looking at least for PDF forms, I'm speaking specifically PDF forms, but there aren't a lot of source programs that can create a fillable PDF form, right? And right now InDesign is one, Venngage is another. So really, really powerful.
Okay, so I'm going to switch gears and sort of talk a little bit about, we touched on this earlier on about buy-in, but I want to talk specifically about building a business case and ROI. And Michael, I know, you've had a long and, many years of experience with this. What makes a compelling business case to the leadership as far as, accessibility is concerned?
I think it starts with kind of looking at the population of disabilities in the country and just realizing how many people have disabilities. So depending on the statistics you're looking at, you're looking at 20% plus of the population. And then helping people understand that, you're not only trying to make documents accessible to people who are blind or visually impaired, but there's a lot of other people out there too. I think Dax mentioned people that are colorblind, or people that are low vision, people with mobility impairments, cognitive impairments, et cetera. And so you want to kind of broaden that scope and help people understand what some of those barriers are for those individuals, and then realize that this is a way that you might be able to reach an extra 20% of the population. And that's a huge contribution to probably what everybody wants to do. So, and especially, depending on the age groups or things like that you're working with, that can also impact what you're doing and the level of disability within those populations as well. So thinking about those, broadening your perspective on what the population of people with disabilities are, and implementing solutions around that.
So do you recommend actually building a business case with like numbers and here's how much more revenue we would get, et cetera, et cetera?
I'm not sure. I think a lot of it is done because it's the right thing to do, but I think that you can also build some numbers around it too. You can also, the other numbers to be aware of is that there are some, new DOJ rulings, there's lawsuits and things like that. So there's a number of factors that play into it.
Well, our handout actually
Yeah.
covers this pretty well. So the handout show there are four major motivations for unlocking buy-in from anyone, and it is reducing risk, increasing income, and Michael, you touched on several of these. Social justice and future proofing. Your C-suite, your approving executive is going to resonate with one of these features. And your goal is to find out which one before you present the case. Because if they're really about social justice and you're come in pitching reducing risk, you're missing the mark, right? Or you're like, look, this person's really excited about being ready for the future and making sure that AI can dissect our document and understand it well and be able to provide summaries that are clear and informational. And being an accessible document is going to help that along. That could be a huge motivator. So when we give this handout at the end, you're going to get some really great information about those four key motivations and kind of what the persona looks like for those four.
Chad, do you want to add to that? Like, if not, I want to ask you about metrics and success stories. I think, you know, a lot of times stories are the ones like we kind of mentioned earlier on, either having a direct live experience or stories can greatly influence leadership. You know, what are your thoughts on that? If it's not the metrics, it's stories.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a number of really great success stories, you know, that Dax and I have been through. You know, one of them is actually attending this webinar, and you know who you are, by the way. But you know, we have a lot of organizations. You know, and again, the level of success within those organizations really kind of depended on them, right? I mean, we're there to guide them, to help them, to instruct them. But at the end of the day, they're the ones that have to commit and make this happen, right? And so, you know, we've had several who have been very successful, right? And we have gone in there and literally kind of turned things around for them because, you know, of training, right? We educated the people, gave them the knowledge they needed to do the work appropriately. And, you know, we find, I would say, and Dax, you can disagree with me, but I feel like it's a lot easier to get the people who are actually doing this work to be passionate about this and to really, you know, engage in it and embrace it. They really they end up doing fantastic work, right? And when you can do it at that base level, it has nowhere to grow but up, right? You know what I mean? That behavior, that mentality, it just kind of flourishes, you know, and really, you know, leads to success within those organizations.
And on the flip side, so if I were to play devil's advocate,
Yeah.
what if you know you present all of this information and it's like nothing, you're not getting the response you want, essentially the stakeholders kind of push back, like basically objection handling. What's your experience in objection handling, you know, when someone presents a case or a story and say, hey, we should do this, we should make, you know, our website accessible or documents accessible, and the answer comes back as a no, you know, we don't have the budget for it, whatever the excuse is. You know, how do you handle that? How should, you know, people handle those kinds of objections? Because I think that's a fairly common thing that happens.
I mean, I don't think I can make a blanket statement and say like, oh, this is how I always deal with this situation, because every client's different, right? I think, you know, speaking for Dax and I think what we try to do is evaluate the situation. We try to educate the client on the what's the word I'm looking for? I guess just the downside of kind of turning your back on accessibility, right? I personally don't like to use the threat of the lawsuit in that situation, but it's a very real situation, right? For public organizations, I mean, that there certainly is a threat of a lawsuit. I recently did a catalog for a large automobile manufacturer, and they made their catalogs accessible. Now, did they make it accessible because they wanted to? No, they did it because they got sued. And when I told this story to somebody, they're like, well, what would a non-sighted person be doing driving a car? You're missing the point, right? Everybody enjoys riding in an automobile, right? Whether they have sight or not. And so somebody wanted to enjoy that experience, and they were unable to, because they were unable to consume the content that automobile manufacturer was making public. So it's very real. It's a very real situation. And I think it's just something that, when we're in a situation like that, we try to educate the client, is really what it comes down to.
Okay. Yeah, Michael, you had mentioned something similar as well, the risks of lawsuits and non-compliance. What is your, is that something that you touch upon when you're trying to convince a client or trying to educate a client on what they should, or what they should do with their accessibility?
I think it comes back to actually one of the key things, which is we talked upon earlier, which is identifying like key challenges and conducting an accessibility audit. I think that's really, really helpful, looking at where the state of the organization is, and then periodically, at least annually, revisiting that so that you can see the progress and see, where your risks are and how you're moving the organization forward. So I think that's actually one of the things that I see organizations sometimes missing is, they spend a lot of money on training. They actually are starting to incorporate this, but then they're not closing the loop, and staff have other competing priorities. And so they want to make documents more accessible, but maybe they don't get enough time or feedback in terms of what they're creating. And so sometimes it gets dropped. And I think that's that key element of helping the organization move forward.
How do you think organizations have to stay on top of it, right? Because as you said, they may have a training program, and but they're not looking at the big picture, and there's probably, how do they assess their risk? I guess I'm trying to say, like, how do they keep on top of, aside from doing it once a year, like what is there? Do they need to appoint somebody, for example, and is there, are there roles like organizationally, right?
I do think that organizationally having a champion or a number of champions is really helpful, depending on how the organization's structured. It does take, like the team that I work with, we've got a lot of people that are, have spent years learning about accessibility and really developing those skills. And so having some experts like that within the organization for larger organizations is a great idea. The other one is partnering with organizations like Access Ingenuity or others to help you in that process if you're needing some support.
Okay. And as far as risk is concerned, are they any particular industries or sectors that are more at risk than others, right? I know, for example, just looking at data several years ago, e-commerce was one of those, retail, / e-commerce, one of those, hot areas for lawsuits. Yeah, I don't know if there's any now. I'm not a lawyer. I don't really monitor the risks in different industries. But I'm sure someone's doing it, and there, do you know if there's certain basically hot industries that if you're in that industry, you should, you're in a high risk, sort of a area.
I'll take, so I'm going to paste into chat. So every year, I think several times a year, actually, UsableNet puts out a report that talks about the lawsuits and insights based on industry and the amount This is, federal and health industries and hotel and hospitality, restaurants, all that stuff. So if you go to that, you'll see a series of charts and graphs. In addition to downloading the report, gives you even more information than what's listed in the main article. But I think in this day and age, if you've got money and exposure, you have risk, right? I mean, there really
Right.
is a point. And there are some rulings, some recent rulings in different areas where that talk about maybe, if you don't have a brick and mortar store, does that really make you accountable for the Americans with Disabilities Act? And do you sell in a certain area? And all sorts of specifics. I think that I'd love to have time to go through in this webinar, but I just don't think we do. But the reality is, if you have money and you want to keep it, the reality is someone's going to try to take it from you. So reducing risk is really usually a priority for the people that are holding the purse strings. So.
Well, and
Right,
of
and I
all
think-
the, sorry, Eugene,
Go
but
ahead.
of all the
Yeah.
sectors, right, that were to, all the various like sectors, that could affect. I mean, e-commerce, if you want to talk about a sector of the population that just levels the playing field and says, we don't care who you are, you're going to be shopping online. That's one of the areas where, I don't care who you are, you're shopping online. And I think, as a matter of fact, I think for non-sighted users, I think they shop online more than potentially a sighted user does, because it's often the only way that they can effectively shop. So that's a really big area for sure.
I would add to that, it's just so much more convenient, since transportation is a challenge.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of challenges, right? I mean, we had a guest on our podcast, Dax, and I asked her about the experience of going grocery shopping. And she basically said to me, I don't. I shop online, because to physically go to a store and try to pick out your products, the only way to make it happen is to have an assistant walk with you to help you with the process. So, e-commerce makes them 100% in control, and they can do everything themselves, which is very empowering for them.
That's a very good point. I also want to add, for aside from lawsuits, there's also OCR complaints. I think somebody on the chat, it's not there in the chat anymore. So if you're in higher ed, you can also, there's also the risk of OCR complaints. And there are some publications that actually track that as well. I remember reading about it, and I remember reading that OCR complaints had gone up, I don't know, like a significant amount. I don't have the normal data now. I will find that article and hopefully we'll send it to all of you later on. But similar to the DAX article, there's a similar article that also tracks OCR complaints. So if you're in higher ed, it's always a risk, not just from lawsuits, but also from internal complaints. All right, we've got about 15 minutes left. So I want to move us along to the Q&A. Q&A, I want to give at least 10 minutes. There's a lot of questions, and then we'll have a couple of minutes at the end just to wrap up. So we can start with, let me just look at the questions. They are more than 10 questions. So we'll just go we'll go chronologically. I'll read the questions, and I think feel free, whoever feels like they can answer the question, just go ahead and answer them. So the first question is from Caroline, and the question is there a speedy way to deal with hard returns? I think we've answered that question. So yeah, let's move on to the next one. Very new to accessibility, and as a print designer, this is from Ignacio Garcia. As a print designer, I'm very interested in making future designs accessible. Can you please share any suggestions and tips for how and where I can get started? So for print design.
I can start that. I think some of the handouts that you're going to get today was a great place to get started. And then I think the other one is really looking at the source documents that you're working with and making sure that the programs that you're creating support accessibility in a relatively easy fashion or maybe more supportive fashion. And you know, Venngage is a great tool there. You know, InDesign can be a great tool, PowerPoint, Microsoft Word, etc. So just, you know, starting from a good structure and looking at the templates that you're also working with.
Cool. Chad, Dex, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, if you're a print designer, you're probably using Adobe InDesign, and you're already at a really good point. I mean, if you know how to use InDesign, all you really need to do is build upon your knowledge, and you know, fairly easily you're going to be able to create accessible content out of InDesign. Adobe Illustrator, not accessible at all. You know, so if you're building your content in Illustrator, that's going to be a harder path for you. Can be done, but it's going to be a bit of a harder path. But yeah, and I would just you know, basically I would look for some training, you know, whether it's online training or in-person training. I think that would be your first step, is to just get some good training.
Yeah, and I would add, both Chad and Dex they both have a training for InDesign specifically for that. For that. So if you're looking for design, you have the two experts here.
And I would add, know the limitations, and Chad touched on this, know the limitations of the program you're using before you start working, right? If you're going to try to design a form, I'm not using Word. If I need to design an infographic, right, I might, or a flyer that's going to get handed out online, I'm going to use Venngage over Canva. And I'm not trying to make this an infomercial about Venngage, but I want you to understand something. I've been in contact with the people, with the developers at Canva, like literally talking tech. The underlying core structure that makes a Canva document, the engine that generates the language for the PDF, has some core flaws in it that create a core skeleton of a PDF that make it exponentially harder to generate an accessible PDF. Even if you strip all the tags, you're like, well, I'll just tag it manually. Good luck with that. Things like lists and nested styles and things like that, or document content that's nested, become really hard to tag, even with some of the manual tools. So know the limitations of the tools before you start using them, because if your whole company is built on Google Docs, you're going to have some major issues on workflow trying to get those Google Docs out as PDFs.
Okay, so let's go on to the next question. I think this question,
real quickly, yeah, I forget who said it, but one of the handout stacks is, I think it got corrupted, the checklist. So we'll get an updated link out for you. Just give us a little bit. Sorry about that.
Oh, holy cow. Yeah. I just opened the sample. Boy, that is not what we intended for.
I know.
If you open yeah, great. Not a problem. We will definitely get that fixed for you and get that back out.
I don't think I've ever seen that before.
Thank you for catching that. Next question is essentially I'll read it out. The thing I'm having the biggest issue is how to justify the licensing of a reader for Mac. So I'm assuming a screen reader for Mac, convincing the IT department who doesn't think that it's, you know, they need it. So and we all know it's very clunky and confusing. I think that's the question.
So I can take that one. So Mac does have you know, the built-in voiceover that you can use.
Yeah.
The voiceover on Mac, unlike iOS, is not nearly as popular as JAWS or NVDA, so which is available on Windows. And if you my company actually, we work really closely with individuals who are blind or visually impaired, and do a lot of screen reader training with those individuals. And the bulk of them are using tools like JAWS predominantly, and to a lesser degree NVDA. So working with one of those, just knowing that that's like the common tool that your end users are using, is one way to justify it. And then the other one is just in terms of your ability to test documents, you can test it probably, I want to say, 3 to 4 times faster with JAWS than you could with the Mac voiceover option. So it's going to speed up your workflow.
Yeah, I would agree. But voiceover, the only way I could describe it is like voiceover dives too deep into the document. It's really weird. Like you find yourself like stuck in this box within the document sometimes, and it's really frustrating. Where JAWS and NVDA is simply looking at the tag structure, and so it's very simple to use. It's very fluid. And if you are a Mac user, I mean, I'm a Mac user myself. I run parallels on my Mac so that I can run things like JAWS and NVDA and test documents appropriately. So that's that's really your only option, to be honest.
I just Caroline beat me to it, but she asked me the question right as I hit enter. Where did I get the statistic for 8%? I just posted a link to the WebAIM report that gets put out yearly. Now, the sample size is small, but it's the only sample we have, the only statistics that we have about usability from a document, from a accessibility standpoint. But there are some really great charts and graphs in there that talk about percentage of users using NVDA and JAWS and other software, whether it's on desktop or mobile. And Apple VoiceOver works great on a mobile. In fact, it reads a PDF much better on a mobile device than it does in a desktop environment. But in a desktop environment, boy, it is just a challenge to get through a document on a Mac.
Well, and I'll just share a little tip that I learned. If you are bent on using VoiceOver, you'll get better results if you open your PDF in the preview application instead of Adobe Acrobat. It's kind of a wonky workflow, but you actually end up with better results. I still think VoiceOver is wonky, but like if that's your only option, you'll get better results if you open your PDF in preview instead of Acrobat.
Okay, right. Let's move on with the questions. We've got less than 10 minutes. So what are some examples of successful case studies where educational institutions implement accessibility changes that significantly improved user experience? So Michael, have you worked with higher ed and
we've worked with a lot of different higher ed organizations, and I don't know that they've published any case studies, but I think that it comes back to developing a kind of a robust system around it. So basically, we talked about this previously. Some of the groups that we worked with, require accessible documents. They require like an accessibility attestation statement along with their documents. So if somebody comes to you and says, I want you to upload this document, then you have a kind of a process by which you can say, okay, well, where's your accessibility attestation saying that you've actually tested this document for accessibility? I think that's a really good best practice. And then doing annual audits and making sure that the organization is actually staying on top of compliance, working also with all the source flows of documents into your organization. So I think that sometimes with higher ed, there's a whole bunch of different sources for those documents, from different departments within your organization to external agencies that are also creating documents for you, and getting everybody on board and into that process.
Yeah, and I'll add, I think we did a case study with Colorado State University, and we can we'll send it out an email in case someone wants to actually see a case study.
And I just pasted a link into chat. We had guests on our podcast specifically from higher ed talking about how adopting accessibility and how to get your boss to listen. So matter of fact, I think one of the people on that podcast is actually in our audience right now, attending this webinar.
Okay, let's move on to that. Oh, this is a really interesting question. So I've been hearing more and more about how there's a push away from PDFs, which I understand from the perspective of it being a publishing format. However, is the alternative of CSS HTML feasible given the steep training curve and tech adoption aversion?
I'd be happy to take that because I think it was Craig who also posted something about how we need to get away from PDFs and move to EPUB, right? And so similar to Michelle's question, I mean, EPUB is effectively HTML and CSS. And EPUB is a tremendously accessible format, right? It's a fantastic format. Love it. It's great. But what you've got to be willing, but what you've got to prepare yourself for is to sacrifice your design for the format, because you cannot maintain the design that you do in a PDF document, created from wherever, in the EPUB format. It's just too challenging. And if you want to talk about level of effort, I mean, now for EPUB, you've got to have solid knowledge of HTML, CSS, file structure in order to make that document accessible. So I'm not disagreeing with you. I think EPUB is a fantastic and lovely format, but I think it's really short-sighted to say no PDFs, we got to move everything to EPUB, because it's just not realistic, right? And so if you're willing to if you're building a book like a novel or a long form book, heck yeah, EPUB all day. I wouldn't even want that to be in a PDF. But if you're looking at a designed document, PDF's the only way to maintain that design. And so that's where you've got to balance the two and figure out, okay, what am I willing, what are the pros and cons of each of the formats, and make your decision from there.
Okay, that would be, and if I would add, my short answer to that is there are, different ways. I think PDFs are very good for, like you said, highly like visual designs. If you just want to get a checklist or something very simple out, like you can probably build a very simple HTML file, right? Versus like a poster, like try having a very visual poster with an infographic on an HTML. That's very, very difficult. And it's not the right tool probably to do that as well.
Well, and I think EPUB's a little bit more attainable for most people. I mean, Adobe InDesign can export to the EPUB format. Not sure about Microsoft Word or not. But one of, I've heard a lot of people say, oh, we need to move everything to HTML, to the web. And my question to them is, how many people within your organizations have the ability to create a web page on your company website, right? The answer is like 3. Right. So,
right.
Sure, if you want to offload all that work to those 3 people and say, okay, you're now responsible for building all these web pages that all these people want to create. Sure. That if you can, maintain that, I would agree. But documents are more attainable for the masses. Right.
Okay. We have 2 more minutes left. So I think what we can do with the questions is we'll compile it out. We will try and answer them offline, and then we will send you in the follow-up emails. We will send you a list of the questions and the questions that we can answer offline. But I do want to give a chance to all of the panelists, to sort of give their closing remarks and anything else they want to share. Any offers they have for the audience. So let's start with Michael.
Well, great. Well, thanks so much for inviting me to participate in this panel. Really enjoyed the discussion. I think it's a great discussion to have and to think about. If anybody that's attending wants to follow up with us, I'd be happy. Our team would be happy to do a free document consultation with you and hopefully help you get your some ideas around how to build an accessible practice for your documents. So happy to work with you, and if you can reach out to me, I'll put my email address in the chat here. And thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Dax?
Yeah, so I'll let you know that we have our next few classes, our Accessibility for Word on Thursday, February 6th. The Secrets of Writing Effective Alt Text on the 20th, March's classes are PDF tags tree basics. I know someone had asked a question, how do I get training for the absolute beginner? March 6th is our training. We have testing with NVDA. And then in April, we have accessible forms. And if you want a decent discount, $75 off, use the coupon code CHACS2025. And I'm going to put that in the chat. And we'd love to see you in class.
Cool. Chad, any final words?
I think Dax kind of summed it up pretty well for me, but yeah, I mean, like this was a great conversation. Always happy to talk about this with people and, talk about the challenges, the benefits, the pros and cons. And I just think it's a really good discussion to have to give everybody a really good, understanding of, what we do when we're making our content accessible. So thank you everybody for coming today.
Yeah, and thank you all of you for coming, and thank you to our panelists for sharing your expertise, insights, and experiences today. It's been great. Love hanging out with all of you. And as you know, I'm the CEO of Venngage. If anybody wants a free trial, if you're curious, just drop us a note, and we'll get on it. So thank you very much. Have a nice day, everyone.